This week we are moving. We are moving texts. We are moving from the biblical text to the next phase, and in a sense, kind of moving from the Bible to what can be nominally called the beginning of Judaism per se. We are moving now to the era of Midrash, which was perhaps one of the first attempts to deal with a problem, I guess, that Judaism has been trying to cope with ever since, which is what to do with the legacy of the Bible, and more generally, the legacy of the written word. For tonight, our lecturer will be Professor Gary Porton, who is the perfect person to lecture on this subject, not only because this is one of his many specialties, but also because he understands the power and the meaning of the written word. And I'll just repeat something that he said to me the other day when we met in preparation for this class. I asked him about his biography, whether he's okay with me reading the text that's on the official website. And he told me, he said yes, because if you give a bad lecture, none of that matters anyway. Now, this lecture is not going to be bad. It's going to be wonderful. And at any rate, I'm going to read his biography because customs, etc. Professor Gary Porton is the Sarah and Charles Dropney Professor Emeritus of Talmudic Studies in Judaism at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where he has taught courses in the history of Judaism, religious responses to the Holocaust, American Judaism, Judaism in late antiquity, Jewish customs and ceremonies, and Jewish sacred literature. He is the author of 7 books, over 35 book chapters and journal articles, and over 80 dictionary and encyclopedia articles and entries. Most of his publications focus on Judaism in late antiquity. Please help me welcome Gary Porton.
How's this going hard?
There you go.
Okay. As Yafat said, we're moving from the Bible about 700-800 years later. A lot of things happened. Let me just make a couple of comments about the Bible. The Tanakh, or the Hebrew Bible, contains literature probably from the 10th century before the Common Era. That's probably the poetry, all the way to the year 167. As Rabbi Tor told you, the book of Daniel we can date specifically, because the book of Daniel knows about Antiochus's destruction of the temple in 167, but doesn't know of Judah's getting the temple back in 164. So the author of Daniel thinks that the end of the world is 167. He didn't see the world being rebuilt in 164. So we can date that. And the poetry, the Song of the Sea, probably is from the 10th century. The other issue is, though, that it covers history probably from the year 2000, which is when people think that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have lived, all the way to, again, 167. So that's a lot of history, and that's a lot of literature being put together. By the 2nd century before the Common Era, sometime between 160 and 130 before the Common Era, the 24 books of the Hebrew Bible were put together in the order we have them. We know that because in the 1st century, everybody agrees what's there. And there's a lot of things going on that we know happen. The Hebrew Bible begins with God creating the world and ends with Cyrus decreeing that the Babylonian exiles can go back to the land of Israel. Why that's important is because the Christian Bible doesn't have the books in the same order. the Christian Bible, that is the Protestant Bible and the Catholic Bible, they're not the same in the book orders, end with the prophets. And the reason they end with the prophets is because, as far as they're concerned, prophecy foretells Jesus, and that's where they want to go. In Judaism, if you look at the way the Bible is put together and the way that we see the Bible and the way that Jews saw the Bible in the first centuries, the Bible is about God's creating the world, giving the land to Abraham's descendants, Abraham's descendants getting kicked off the land, Abraham's descendants getting back on the land. And as far as the people who put the Bible together, that is the end of the story. That's the end of the biblical story. The rest of the story is going to move forward. But they're going to look back at those 24 books and say, that is a coherent document. That's a lot of imagination because it's not coherent. But they're going to see it as a coherent document, interrelated to everything. And you saw over the first 3 lectures that these sections aren't interrelated, and they're not organized, and they're a little crazy, and they're repetitious, and they're all sorts of things. And the more you read the Hebrew Bible, the more confusing it becomes. But if you stand outside the Hebrew Bible and look back, which is what all Jews are going to do from our period on, from the first century of the Common Era on, they're going to see something different than they saw when they were putting it together or when they were living through it. Okay, and that's important because beginning somewhere in the first century of the Common Era, or the Common Era, when we say first century, we mean that 200-year period because you can't break things down any clearer. Somewhere in that 200-year period, Jews began to look at the Hebrew Bible, and they're now becoming Jews, and they began reading the Hebrew Bible as part of the synagogue service. Philo, Jew of Alexandria, the Gospels, Luke, Josephus, and even the rabbis all agreed that in the first century of the Common Era, on Shabbat, the Torah is being read. And if you take the story in Luke on face value, and you probably should, there's no reason not to, parts of the prophetic books are also being read. I don't know if you know the story, but Jesus stands up at the synagogue and reads a passage from Isaiah and says, this is all about me, and we're moving forward. So by the first century, the Torah is being read, and probably other parts of the Bible are being read. So they're looking back at the story. What did they see? The first thing they see is that God created the world. God created the world according to a plan. The world is organized. It is linear. There's a beginning and an end, which in the ancient world is a pretty unique view of history, because even the Greeks thought that history went in cycles. The Israelites were the first people to have a linear history, as far as we know. It's a curious linear history because, as you know, the seasons roll along in cycles. So it's a linear history with cycles rolling along on the linear plane. But the Bible has a beginning and an end. It's organized that way, from God's creation of the world to the return. God could have, as some gods did, he could have said, all right, I have a plan. Good luck. Those who have figured it out are going to win. That's what Gnosticism and mysticism is about. Or he could have said, I have a plan. I'm going to tell it to you. And all you've got to do is figure out what it means and do it. In Judaism, as the way the rabbis read it, God told us to plan at Sinai. And you have to remember that Sinai is not a one-day event. Sinai is all of Exodus, all of Leviticus, and the first 9 chapters of Numbers. So that virtually all of the laws, because Deuteronomy is supposed to be merely Moses remembering what he told you before, although it's much different. All of the laws were told either at Sinai or in that tabernacle that they built at the end of Exodus, the tent of meeting, the tabernacle, whatever it is. So that as you look back from the first century, you see God created the world according to a plan. He revealed that plan. And then Deuteronomy and Jeremiah tell you that if you follow the plan, you're going to win, but you're never going to follow the plan because you're always going to lose. But then God's going to be good and gracious, and he's going to let you win again. I mean, Deuteronomy is basically, Deuteronomy and Jeremiah have to explain reality. And reality is not always what we want it to be. The other thing you see when you move out is that being on this land is God's plan without telling you where the land is. If you take the 3 times the borders of the land are described in Genesis 12, 15, and 17, it's never the same. The land goes, by one version, goes all the way to the Tigris-Euphrates River. By another version, goes to the Jordan. It includes Asia Minor. It doesn't include, I mean, it doesn't matter where the land is. But God gave us the land, us, that is Jews, and only Jews should live in the land. If you read Genesis and Exodus, what you discover is, of course, is that all the people are being kicked out of the land, and they're all being moved to the borders. And Rashi, in his commentary on Genesis, has a really neat map in some of the editions where he puts all the people, all the lands. So Israelites and all Israelites and only Israelites are going to live in this land. If you want to know what God says or what the Torah means, you go to a priest. If you read Moses' blessing at the end of Deuteronomy, you will find that the word Torah and law occurs with the priest. Whatever the Urim and Thummim were, and nobody knows what they clearly were a yes and no answer. If the Urim came up or the Thummim came up, they were part of the high priest's breastplate. And they told you what God wanted. You went to the high priest with a yes or no question, and whatever came out, whatever they did, and it's really fun to read what people think they did because they have no clue. So it's like a Ouija board or like shooting dice. I mean, but they have no idea. All we know is that these things were on the high priest's breastplate, and somehow they told you what God wanted. But you went to a high priest. Israel was going to be ruled by a king appointed directly by God or by the king's family, chosen by God. God chose Saul, God got mad at Saul, David, he chooses David, and then David's descendants become the kings. And it doesn't matter whether they're good or they're bad, they just become kings. Prophets will tell the Israelites and deliver directly from God, God's message. That's what prophets do, and I understand had a really wonderful lecture on prophecy. Okay. That's what the Hebrew Bible tells you. Now, when you get to the first century, none of that is true. Israelites, or Jews by this time, are spread all over the world. They're Asia Minor, all the way probably through Asia Minor. We know they're as far east as Iran. The largest Jewish population is in Alexandria. 2/5 of the city of Alexandria is Jewish. They're all over the place. The geographer Strabo says that there is not a civilized place in the world where there are not Jews. There are Jews in Rome, there are Jews in Greece, there are Jews all over the place. The second thing we know is that the Jews within the land of Israel, wherever this land is, are the minority population. there are more non-Jews living in this border, in this Syria, Palestine, whatever it is, than there are Jews. The high priesthood has been completely screwed up. The Maccabees were a priestly family, but they had no right to be the high priest. And by the time you get on the other side of Herod, Herod has appointed a 15-year-old Babylonian to be high priest because he was mad at the high priest. It's like Roosevelt in the Supreme Court. Only Herod was able to do it. There's no king, and if Syria, Palestine is being ruled by Rome, Herod's the most immediate ruler. He's comes from the Idumeans who were forcibly converted under the Maccabees. So that doesn't work. Prophecy ended when the Maccabees take back the altar. They take apart the defiled altar and they say, we will keep these stones over here until a prophet arises to tell us what to do with them. So by 164, there's no prophets. There are no kings. The high priesthood is a total joke. The world that the Bible says isn't. But the Bible was given by God as a guide to how we should live our lives. Therefore, it is true. As Yvonne said, that becomes the problem, or at least one of the problems. Now, this period from the Maccabees to the beginning of the rabbinic period, which is sometime in the 1st century, the first person to be called a rabbi is Jesus. The first time the title appears in print is Jesus. So it's sometime in the 1st century. And again, it's a gospel quote, so you don't know how authentic it is, but it's an interesting thing. The only person to call himself a Pharisee, to say, I am a Pharisee, is Paul. Nobody else ever calls himself a Pharisee. Enemies called them Pharisees, but nobody called himself a Pharisee but Paul. That's what it is. That just screws things up more. What it tells you, and what we don't fully recognize, is that early Christianity, until you get it probably to the 3rd, 4th century, was just a form of Judaism. And Christians and Jews and Christians couldn't tell one another apart. That's why we get screaming, because nobody's quite sure who you are. And the Romans have no clue. They just know about these crazy people living in Syria, Palestine. And they have no use for Jews and no use for Christians. And it's not until probably the 4th, 5th century that we actually begin to see a divergence and we can tell the difference. Okay, but we're in the 1st century. This period from the Maccabees to the 1st century is a period whose name we do not know. It used to be late Judaism because in scholarship, early Judaism was the Bible. Late Judaism was this period between the close of the Bible and the New Testament. And New Judaism was Christianity. Then it became intertestamental. Well, you can't have intertestamental if you only have one testament, and we only have one testament, so it's only intertestamental for Christians. So that didn't work. You can call it Hellenistic from the death of Alexander the Great in the 320s to the rise of Muhammad, maybe, in the 7th century. And then even through the medieval period, we're still into a Hellenistic world. So Hellenistic doesn't quite work. So we came up with the phrase late antiquity. Antiquity is everybody before Alexander. Alexander begins late antiquity, which then goes on until you decide the Middle Ages begins, which is God knows when. So. But this period is a period in which The world changes in all sorts of fascinating ways. The Greek world of the 5th century before the Common Era, which is the time of Ezra and Nehemiah and the great Greek philosophers, and was the time of the polis. Everything was organized around your city. With Alexander, the world opens up, and you're now no longer a person living in a city, you're now a cosmopolitan, a person living in the entire cosmos. Philosophy moves from, the nature of good to how do I live my life personally? The Stoics, the Epicureans, the Christians, the Jews are worried about personal ethics, not big questions, little questions, and little practical questions. Religion becomes a religion of concern with the afterlife. The first mention of the afterlife is Daniel. The last verses of Daniel, which is again late in the middle of the Hellenistic age. It is a culture obsessed with purity and impurity, ritual purity and impurity. Those of you who know Judaism will know that takes up, I think it's been estimated, it may take up as much as 5/8 of rabbinic literature, maybe on the issue of ritual purity. I mean, it's an inordinate number. And the Hellenistic world is concerned about understanding old documents. There's Neoplatonism, where they start redoing Plato. There's a whole school of people in Alexandria worried about how do you take Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and make them relevant in the 1st century. So what the Jews are doing in Judea, what the Jews are doing in Alexandria, what the Jews are doing in Syria, and what they're doing in Rome is creating a Jewish form of Hellenism. And depending on where you live, it's a different form of Hellenism. So that if you're living in Alexandria, Egypt, your language, and the only language you seem to know, is Greek. The Septuagint, the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, was probably translated in the 3rd century before the Common Era because they couldn't read Hebrew. And the great Jewish philosopher Philo can't read Hebrew. His entire philosophy and his entire exegesis of the Hebrew Bible is based on a Greek translation. You can tell by what he's doing. Even Jews living in ancient Israel and Palestine, in Judea, and the Galilee, apparently couldn't understand the Hebrew Bible sufficiently to know what was going on, because you get a whole series of Aramaic translations, which begin in the 2nd century before the Common Era and go all the way to the 3rd, 4th century of the Common Era.
Well, you mean they spoke Aramaic before they went back? They spoke Aramaic before they went back to the Galilee?
Yeah. The language issue is a big issue. Hebrew was spoken all the way to the 2nd century by the elite. Aramaic was the lingua franca.
2nd century Common Era.
Yeah.
I just didn't know they spoke Aramaic before they went to exile to Babylonia.
No, it's at the same time. It has to do with the exile coming back, and Aramaic is becoming the language. However, the most popular language in Esharim, which is the rabbinic cemetery, is Greek. The rabbis, the intellectuals, were fluent in Greek. Greek presents a whole problem in rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Joshua says, quoting Proverbs, you shall dwell on them day and night to mean you should dwell on Hebrew text day and night, and you can't teach your children Greek. We're told, however, and the proof is in the documents, in the sarcophagi and all the inscriptions. We're told that Rabbi Ishmael says there are 6 baskets for collecting gifts in the temple. 3 of them are marked Aleph Bet Gimel, and 3 of them are marked Alpha Beta Gamma. This is within the temple itself. So the spread of Greek was actually among the elite. And probably if you lived in a major city and you had to do business, you probably had to be able to at least counter Greek. So this is the world. It's a very cosmopolitan world. It's a world where the Hebrew Bible, when it says should happen, doesn't, isn't. And yet we know the Hebrew Bible is true. So how do we live in this new world? We live in the new world the same way that everyone else is doing. We have a text, and our text is the Hebrew Bible, more specifically the Torah. Other people are claiming this text. In fact, you can divide people among the Jewish community by how they deal with the text. You could look at Christianity and say, Christianity is merely a different interpretation of the Hebrew Bible, which as a matter of fact it is. Qumran, those people at the Dead Sea, many of you have been there, are interpreting the Hebrew Bible in their own way. Philo is interpreting the Hebrew Bible through allegory and demonstrating over and over again that it's nothing but Platonic philosophy. But they're all taking the same text. And they're all looking at the text. And they're following the tradition which we find in the text itself. They're interpreting the sacred literature. I think on the second set of handouts you got, there were lists of psalm titles, which have nothing to do with the psalm, but take the psalms and put them in historical settings. There's one we say every morning, which is a psalm to David at the dedication of the temple. Now, David didn't dedicate the temple. David didn't build the temple. But somebody decided that this psalm was a psalm for David. There's a psalm entitled, this is the psalm of David when he fled Absalom, which is his fight with the son. There are any number of psalm titles which are setting these poems in a particular historical setting. And if you read them, you can see somebody's got a good imagination. Because most of them you can't get there unless somebody tells you. Chronicles takes Kings and Samuel, word for word, except where it decides it wants to change it. Deuteronomy, when it retells Exodus and Numbers, remember Moses dies at 120. He's forgotten a lot of what he said, or misremembering what he said in Exodus and Numbers. Clearly, somebody has rewritten this text for its own purposes, which are beyond this at this time. But this whole issue of interpreting the canonical or the official story has been going on within the Tanakh itself. So what the rabbis do is the rabbis take the Hebrew Bible, knowing it's true, and use it in 2 ways. The first way is exegesis, to read out of it. They look at the text and they see something and they say, gee, why is it written that way? And you'll see in the readings that we're going to do, it can be very fascinating. But there's another way of reading the text, and that's eisegesis, reading into the text. I have something which I think is crucial to Judaism. All I need to do is find a biblical text. They may not be related at all, and as you'll see, they need not be. So you can read into the text or out of the text. And the problem with most of us, and the problem with all sorts of things, is we can't tell what they were doing. It used to be that people would tell you they saw the text, they saw a problem, and they were filling in holes. And then you read the Midrash, and it says, and you look at it and say, yeah, but there's actually more than filling in the holes. They got a whole different point. Well, it was a convenient way to fill in the hole, because by attaching it to the Hebrew Bible, it's Torah Lamoshe Messina. It's Torah given to Moses from Sinai. And again, this is not to belittle anybody's Midrash, but I'm sure you have heard people tell you what the biblical text means, and you sit there and you read it, and you find it very difficult. I will tell you the story I tell everybody I talk to. I grew up in Central California. I was going to the Tulare County Fair, and somebody was reading the Bible, and he said, automobiles are foretold in the Hebrew Bible. Okay? Where do you think automobiles occur in the Hebrew Bible? Ezekiel's chariot. It has lights, the torches in the front. It has 4 wheels. It's obviously an automobile, because the Bible knows everything. I mean, I must have been 8, 9, 10. And even I knew that Ezekiel's chariot wasn't a Ford. But this guy was convinced. He was convinced. And so it becomes a problem. That's one of the things to keep in mind whenever you read Midrash, or whenever you hear a sermon. It could be what the text means, or it could not be what the text means. That's one of the things you have to decide. Now the question is, why do Midrash? Well, one reason to do Midrash is because the Hebrew Bible is a very difficult text. It's something like 70% of the words in the Hebrew Bible are hapax legomenon. They occur only once. There are only 6,000 vocabulary roots in the Hebrew Bible. And then there are all these words that only occur once. And you figure out what they mean by the context. And because Hebrew has letters that sound the same, and that look the same, that are pronounced differently, and there are no vowels in the Hebrew Bible, in the Torah scroll, there are no verses, there are no divisions between words. I mean, there's nothing. It's just a bunch of letters. If you don't know what the Hebrew Bible, what the Torah says before you read it, you can't read it, because you won't know where the words are, and you won't know the tense of the verbs, and you won't know where the sentences are. I mean, it's really curious. And I challenge any of you to pick up a Torah scroll. I don't care how good your Hebrew is, and read an entire column and make sense of it. Blind, without any practice. You can't. And the modern Israeli can't, because they can't get the vocabulary right. Having arguments whether a Leviathan is an alligator or not. It's one of the classic fights you have with modern Israelis over reading the Bible. So one thing is the text. It used to be that people argued that Midrash began as sermons, but these are rabbinic sermons. They're not. There's no evidence that rabbis ever gave sermons. It's based on a 19th century piece of scholarship when the Prussians in the 19th century said Jews can practice Judaism, but they can't do anything they have to do, Leopold Zunz wrote a history of the Jewish service, in which he demonstrated that beginning with Chronicles, sermons had been given forever. Rabbis never gave sermons in the 19th century. They gave 2 sermons a year, one on the Shabbat between Passover, or one on the Shabbat before Passover, and one on the Shabbat between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. That's the only time they ever preached. The rest of the time they sat up, they sat in the corner for rabbis. But they didn't preach. And there's a lot of reason that there are no sermons in the ancient world. Like Jews. Christians are preaching sermons, but Christians have to prove that the Hebrew Bible doesn't mean what it says. Because they've got to read it through the eyes of the crucified and resurrected Christ. So they've got a real issue. They have to prove that a religion that looks like a Hellenistic religion isn't, and they have to prove that Judaism isn't, and that the Bible really talks about Jesus. They have to do a lot of preaching. The rabbis don't. They have to make legal decisions about whether this thing is kosher, whether the thing isn't kosher, but they don't have to do with the Bible. What many of the Midrashim are certifications of holy men doing holy work. You were a priest because your father was a priest. You were a king because you were Davidic. You were a prophet because God spoke to you. And you were a rabbi because of what you knew. You knew the written Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. But you also knew the oral Torah. You also knew what this text meant, how to fill in the gaps, how to use the text. There's a passage in the Babylonian Talmud which says, to become a rabbi, it's attributed to Rob, to become a rabbi, you have to be able to prove from Torah itself that chariots, creepy things, are clean. Now, the Hebrew Bible is very unclear about a lot of things, but the one thing it never wavers on is that a chariot, a creepy thing, is unclean. But to be a rabbi, you had to be able to prove it was clean. Cicero said that to be a rhetorician, you had to be able to prove that the person was guilty and innocent on the same evidence. You had to be able to prove that you knew this stuff so well that you could make it say anything you wanted it to say. And if you look at the second readings on the thick sheet that's stapled together, the second one on the sheet, you will see a passage where the rabbis tell you exactly what they're doing. This passage, no, the one at the bottom. The one says Mishnah Hagiga 8:1a. The rules concerning releases from vows hover in the air. They do not have anything to support them. That is no biblical verse to support them. I'm reading the bottom page of the first page. Under 2. On the one that's stapled together.
Yeah.
Okay. The rules concerning releases from vows hover in the air, and they do not have anything to support them. The laws of Shabbat, the festival offerings and sacrifices, and sacrilege, are like mountains hanging by a hair, where their support in Scripture are few, but their laws are many. Now, if you think about what you read in the Bible about what you can't do on Shabbat, you can't light a fire, you can't collect manna, and you can't pick up sticks. That's all that the Torah says you can't do on Shabbat. There are no 39 classes of major work. There's no 66 classes of minor work. There's no all of this stuff. I mean, Shabbat is one of the longer tractates of the Mishnah, based on all sorts of stuff, none of which is clearly stated in the Hebrew Bible. Now they know that. He's saying that. The laws of Shabbat are a lot, but the verses are few. They know what they're doing. We, because we're Protestants and not rabbis, take everything the rabbis say seriously. They didn't. They knew when they were joking. I mean, for the rabbi to come up and say, you know, all the stuff about Shabbat that we're worried about, we made it all up. That's virtually what they're saying. And if you continue, you find other things. They know it. It doesn't mean it's not important. It doesn't mean that you can violate the laws of Shabbat. But it does mean that we understand that where we are today and where they were in the Torah are not the same place. And that's very important. I could make up, as the rabbis did, a bazillion laws of Shabbat. If I can't connect it to some biblical text, it's not going to work. Or to some biblical story. You're not going to believe me. As we always compare it to the American Constitution. I don't know if you remember 5th grade when you memorized the Constitution. It's a very boring document. And if you think the writers of the Second Amendment thought that you could buy a bazooka at your local Walmart and have it in your backyard, you're crazy. They didn't think that any more than the rabbis imagined elevators going up and down on Shabbat. But we know that there are Shabbat elevators, and we know that in current American law, you have a right to own virtually any gun you want to own.
Oh, but they can't have a bazooka.
I mean, and whatever it is, they will connect it to the Constitution. I mean, look, whenever you think about abortion, if you think a right of privacy is in the Constitution, you know, I mean, there are all sorts of rights, but a right to privacy is very hard to find them. I mean, the Warren Court found it, but or the courts found it. If they can't find it, if these 9 men can't agree on it, it's not there. If the 5 of the 9 agree, it's there. If the rabbis decide this is what we should do, they'll find a verse. I mean, that's the point. So one of the things that Midrash does is to keep us connected to this text, which was put together in the 2nd century before the Common Era. Another thing it does is help us understand how that text can possibly function in our lives today. But that isn't the primary reason for Midrash. The primary reason for Midrash is to prove to you that I know the text. And as Jews become further and further from the text, as they're going to become further and further as the world keeps changing in the medieval period, Midrash is going to become even more important. A couple of points, and then I'll give you a chance to do some reading. One of the most curious things about rabbinic literature, all of it, and you're going to hear from Barry Wimpheimer, who's this wonderful Talmud scholar, you're going to hear the same sort of thing. All rabbinic texts are collections. They're not written by one person and they're put together over a long period of time. Dating them is very difficult. The rabbis were not interested in people. They were interested in the people's words. At the same time that Plutarch is writing biographies, Jews aren't. At the same time that the church fathers are writing these complex theological essays in the same place in Syria, Palestine, Jews aren't. Or properly, Jews didn't decide to save them. I find it difficult to believe that no Jew ever was a philosopher or ever was a theologian. The tradition didn't save them. What they saved were little snippets, little stories. Basically, out of context, there's very little context in the literature, even less context than there is in the Gospels, because they don't care about context. They care about the words, and the words flow. They don't really care who says them, although they tell you you've got to quote your teacher. If you follow these quotes and compare them from document to document, they're not consistent. People change their mind. By not having context, you don't know how important the statement is. You don't know when it was said. You don't know when the person was kidding. You don't know anything. And you don't know what you don't have. You don't know what their choices were. All you know is what you have. If we knew what they had and what they threw away, then we could begin to decide, all right, this is why they took this one and that one and not that one, that one. But we don't know that. And all we know is what we have from the intellectual elites. Same thing in the Greco, in the Roman world, the Greek world. What we would say or write to one another, in the ancient world, they didn't have emails that never went away. We don't have. We have some scribbles. We very often don't know what they mean. All we have is what we have that what the intellectual comes. And very often when we do the archaeology does not conform to what we would expect by reading the intellectual's texts. If you read the Talmud, you would not know, or you're surprised by the fact that at the burial grounds of the rabbis, some of whom recorded the Talmud, the primary language is Greek. And what they've done is they've taken sarcophagi created by Hellenistic artisans with all the symbols and all the nymphs and all the gods of the Hellenistic world. They reused them. They got them at a wholesale. They were cheap. And they don't care. And we know who some of these people are because they're quoted in rabbinic literature. They didn't care. And you know that the best preserved zodiacs in the ancient world were on Palestinian synagogues floors. You've seen Beta Alpha, I'm sure. You've seen Tiberius. These are good, and there's a whole new book out on the ones that are in Judea. These are wonderful zodiacs. And it's not that they even changed them. Some of the zodiacs have Jewish stuff in them, but some of them, they just take the stuff. And in the center of the zodiac is the god Helos, usually riding in a chariot. Yeah. Now, if you read the rabbinic literature, you wouldn't think this was happening. But we know it did. So as we read this stuff, remember, we're talking about intellectual elites. We're talking about the upper crust. We're talking about people who knew things. And we're talking about people for whom Judaism has to change or they're out of a job. But if it changes too much, they're out of a job. The trick of rabbinic literature is to deal with the world connected to the Bible and still keep it within the bounds that they imagine Judaism should be. You will hear people say, Midrash, the Bible can mean anything. The Bible can't mean anything in a Jewish context. Either Jesus is on every other page of the Bible, which makes you a Christian, or he's not. You can't have it both ways. And you will find no rabbi proving to you that there's a virgin birth from Isaiah, or that the crucifixion of the Messiah on a tree, on a cross, is foretold in the Hebrew Bible. All of the variation are within strict cultural bounds. It's like you won't see a rabbi proving that a Christmas tree, i.e. a Hanukkah bush, is kosher from the Torah. It wouldn't have crossed their minds. All right, I've got a series of texts. You have in front of you a series of texts. I want to divide you up by fours. I want the odds to start from the end and move frontwards, and want the evens to start frontwards and move towards the back. So I'd like you to read all of them. I'll count off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. Put the ones over here, the twos over there, the threes over there, the fours over there.
I'm completely confused.
I want you to move. I want all the ones together, all the twos together, all the threes together, all the fours together. I want you to start and go through the text. I want you to see if you can determine what exegesis, eisegesis, and I want you to see if you can figure out what you think they're doing. And when you get out of the text. And open to all sorts of
Thanks, Gary.
that the texts are weird and open to all sorts of interpretations. I'll tell you what they mean, but that's just what my opinion of what they mean. The second thing is that if you look at them carefully, you can see some of them just being put together. I mean, you can just see, but that the differences among the rabbis is not all that great. And you may get 2 or 3 people repeating. So, I mean, it's a fascinating thing. I was asked, do people believe these? In a traditional setting, the biblical, I mean, first of all, this comes to modern Judaism through Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Nachmanides and all the biblical commentators, because this is what they based all the commentaries on. They're the ones who pass the tradition on. I mean, Rashi tells you, and Rashi every once in a while tells you when it is quoting something. And there are stories you know that are Midrashic stories that aren't in the text. And you're not sure they're not in the text. Abraham destroying his father's idols before he takes off. That's Midrash and not Bible. Lilith is Midrash and not Torah. And a lot of the things you think you know about the biblical characters is really Midrash and not in the stories themselves. All right. The first example is an example, I mean, it's there to show you. A lot of people think that the earliest Midrashic collections, Sifra, Sifrei, and Mechilta, were created because Mishnah doesn't tell you what the biblical verses are. If you, my teacher, Jacob Neusner, made a lot of brilliant statements, but it's one of his most important statements. If you stand in the Mishnah, you can figure out the biblical text. If you stand in the Bible, you have no idea where Mishnah is going to go. You can read backwards, but reading forward you can't. And that first example on page 1 shows you Mishnah Hulin 9:4, which just tells you what Ishmael and Akiva thought. And then Sifra, not liking that, gives you the biblical verse. Now, whether that's true or not, God only knows. But much of Mechilta and much of Sifra does that. It's very upset that Mishnah doesn't give you verses. So it just takes Mishnah's laws and gives you verses. So that's why that example's there. And then the other one we told you. I'm interested in, if you didn't get caught in the details of the second example of Midrashim 3, that long passage from the opening of Sifra. And then Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him. And what this teaches us. What's the Midrash trying to do? I mean, without getting tied up into the detail, what's it trying to do? That long passage that goes on for 2 pages. No, we read it? If you,
When I reread it,
okay, yeah.
my conclusion, which not everyone agreed with, that it goes to illustrate your point, that a master of, Midrash, Torah, can make the same citation through either thing, just as a master of repetition, could, innocent and guilty in the same sense back.
But what's the deciding factor? The deciding factor is quoting scripture. You might think that this is, now every law on this one, who can put their hands on, all that stuff, that's all decided. They all know that. This is not, they're not worried about the law, they're worried about how do you prove the law is right? Because you might think that you learn that calling proceeds from this example, but that example is not really the same. Well, then you might think from this example, well, that example is not really the same. Well, you might think from this example, well, that example is not really the same. How do you know that calling always precedes talking? Because Leviticus 1:1 says, Scripture in Sifra, and Sifrei, and Mechilta always trumps reason.
Trumps what?
Reason. You can use your mind, but the deciding factor is the quotation. Because what Midrash wants is whatever you think to be connected to a biblical verse. Whether it's a good connection or not. I mean, and as I say, you can sit there and read these connections and think, that's a really good imagination. I mean, as much as I enjoy hearing rabbis preach, you can sit at some of those Saturday mornings or Friday nights and think, I don't understand how that connects. I mean, it may well, but you're trying to figure out. And if you take the second example, the one from Mechilta, or the one from Sifrei Numbers, for the stranger who draws near shall be put to death. That's the same thing. It gives you all this logic, but finally you need the biblical verse, and that trumps logic. Now in Talmud, that's not the case all the time. But much of Talmud is also finding biblical verses to settle arguments. All right, how God created the world, which is C, Genesis Rabbah. What did you learn from that about God's creating the world?
I thought we were just reading the one that we had. We didn't-
Oh, well, okay. I wasn't clear. If you look at C, C is an interpretation of Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created. Okay? And the Midrash starts by quoting Proverbs. I was with them as an alone, the source of the light every day. Why start in Proverbs to interpret Genesis? What does that tell you? Anyway,
that whoever wrote Proverbs, knew what the reference was.
and how do they relate? Yeah.
Isn't it by taking a book from the beginning and the end, it shows that together?
It shows that you can't interpret one part of the Bible without the other part of the Bible, that it's all interconnected. Now remember what I said at the beginning. This is literature from the 10th century to the 2nd century. It's 800 years of literature. When you're standing in the 1st century of the Common Era, it's all interconnected. Why is that important in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century? If you're living in Palestine, and all Midrash comes from Palestine, the only example of Babylonian Midrash we have is in Tractate Megillah, which is a long, continuous Midrash on Esther. Other than that, we have no extended Midrash from Babylon. Why is it important to connect, to say you can't read Ketuvim by themselves, you can't read the prophets by themselves, and you can't read the Torah by itself? Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe because it gives equal weight to everything, and therefore you can't like one be more important than another. Like, you say you could just read this, then you wouldn't need to read that.
Okay, everything's of equal importance. What else?
It's all interconnected as a whole. There's nothing else.
Okay, that this is it's not a closed book, but has borders. What is Paul saying? What do Paul's letters tell you? Torah isn't important, only the prophetic books are important. And the rabbis, 100 years later than Paul, are saying exactly what Martha said. They're all important. You can't cut any of them out. And they're all interrelated. So that claims that prophecy is the only thing that's important don't work. And there's a whole form of taking a verse in the middle of nowhere and connecting it to another verse in the middle of nowhere and proving to you, if you follow this all the way through, that everything is interconnected and is all telling the same unified story with a lot of parts. Contradictory parts, but still parts. But it's unified. It's an important thing for the rabbis. Because remember, they're looking back. If anybody did more of this, you discovered why the world is created with a bet and not with an olive. It's created for a bet because a bet is open, going this way and closed on this way, so you can't ask what is before creation. Why is that important? Because there's a whole form of Judaism and a whole form of Christianity and a whole form of Greek philosophy which is trying to figure out what happened before. And the rabbis are saying no. At the same time that there are all of these rabbis developing Merkabah mysticism, and there's a whole brand of mysticism in Judaism called Maaseh Bereshit, which are the deeds of creation. The people who put together Genesis for Allah said no. You can ask things going forward from Ba and Bereshit. You can't ask about what God was doing before. Even though, if you kept doing pages, they do exactly that, almost. The other reason it's a bet is because the bet, if you know the way the Pentateuch goes, if you ask the bet who created you, it points upward. Mm-hmm. And if you ask the bet what's his name, it points to the second word of the Hebrew Bible, which is Elohim, God. So that, and then of course the Aleph is screaming, on the first letter of the alphabet, why didn't you create the world with me? And God said, because you're the word of a curse. Arur is a curse. I created with the word of a blessing, bracha. But tomorrow I'm going to create the Ten Commandments, and when I reveal the Torah, I'm going to begin with the Aleph. Anochi Adonai Elohim. I'm the Lord your God. So the letters are talking as crime. If you went further and found out about God's creating human beings, you'll find out the rabbinic doctrine of human beings. And the rabbinic doctrine of human beings is we are complex creatures, a little lower than the angels and a little higher than the beasts. God knew when God created the world that there were going to be good people and bad people, because that's the way the world is supposed to be. There's a whole series of one of the problems that everybody has, if God did such a good job, why is the world so screwed up? And the rabbi said the world is so screwed up because the world is so screwed up. That's the way God designed it, so that we would have something to do. No, sure. I had a teacher who was a Methodist minister who used to say, when he died, we would ask the question, when you die, are you going to choose your afterlife because of the temperature or because of the company? And he chose the company. And as the rabbis know, God knew that there would be evil people. God, through truth, out of the heavens, created human beings. If you didn't get a chance to read the one about what the Shema means, read it. It's one of my most favorite Midrash in the entire collection. It's a beautiful Midrash about why we say the Shema, what the Shema really means. And the last two examples have to do with rabbinic law not conforming to what we actually do according to Scripture. And the issue is wearing tefillin. Tefillin says on the hand and between your eyes, and we don't wear it on the hand, we wear it on the upper arm. But we don't do it between our eyes, we do it on the thick part of our forehead. Now, it says hand, and so they go through this whole thing where hand doesn't mean hand, but it means the thick part of your upper arm. And then when they do between your forehead, they go through the thing, well, it doesn't really mean between your eyes, it means the thick part of your forehead. How do we know that? Because it's the thick part of your arm. And when they're arguing the thick part of your arm, say, how do we know that? Because it's the thick part of your forehead. So the point is that we're doing things that the Scripture doesn't say, but it meant. And there's a lot of Midrash that does that. Whatever season a kid in his mother's milk means, it doesn't mean you can't eat cheeseburgers. And it was said 3 times as a tagline, because it was said 3 times as a tagline. That doesn't mean you can't eat it, you can't prepare it, and you can't sell it. But you ask anybody about proof that you can't eat a cheeseburger, I'm going to tell you, you can't see the kid in your mother's milk. But that's not what it means. You can't take a particular animal and boil it in a particular milk, the milk of its mother, which had to have been to the biblical mind, which worries about animal families, and especially parents and young. You can't take a bird. And,
What's the milk for cheese?
yeah, you can't do these, and you can't yoke together 2 animals of unequal strength.
Mm-hmm.
The Bible is the Torah is very concerned about animal families. Seething a kid in his mother's milk, whoever was doing it had to have been, to the people of the Hebrew Bible, just something gross. But it means you can't eat cheeseburgers. And with that, I will leave you. Thank you very much. Take this and look at it.
All acabou.
Thank you very much.
So that is,